woman, though he did not know it. On this occasion, in the evening, when the rest of the family had gone to bed, he sat talking with Apakura's mother, or, rather, listening, while the old woman told one of her stories of life on Ahu Ahu, equally fascinating and long drawn out. It is not difficult to reconstruct the scene in imagination. Tari, comfortable in bare feet, and Apambo half reclining against the wall as he smoked his pipe in absent-minded puffs. The woman, cross-legged on the floor, leaning forward in earnest speech, her voice rising, falling, and dying to a whisper in the extraordinary manner of the Polynesian teller of tales, her hands from time to time falling simultaneously with a loud slap to her knees in emphasis of some point in the narrative. The story ended. Little by little the mother led the conversation to the subject of her daughter. Tari began to praise the girl. "What do you think of her?" asked the old woman, "now that you have been away these 5 years?" "There is no other girl like her," said Tari. "Since that is so, take her with you. We shall be pleased, all of us, I in particular, who look on you as a son. She is a good girl. She can sew, she can cook, and the young men say that she is beautiful." "You propose that I take her as a wife?" exclaimed the astonished Tari, to whom, in truth, the idea had not occurred. "Yes, why not? You need a wife, now that the little affair of Tukonini has blown over." "But think, mamma, I am 40 and the child is 16. It is not fitting." "Young wives are best if they are faithful. Apakura will never look at another man." "I will think it over," said Tari. "Let us leave it so. Not this year, at any rate. She is too young." As he bade her good night and turned to go to his sleeping place, the old woman spoke again. "Bear one thing in mind," she said, with a smile. "It will help you to decide. Consider now and then the thought of my daughter married to another." In the end, as is often the case, it was Apakura who settled the matter. Next morning Tari was busy with some stock-taking, and did not board the schooner till the last moment, or notice, in his preoccupation, the mysterious smiles with which the crew greeted him. They were a dozen miles offshore before he folded the last of his papers, lit a pipe, and went on deck for a breath of air. The old woman's last words stuck unpleasantly in his mind, I fancy, as he stood there smoking, with his back to the companionway. All at once he saw the helmsman, an Ahu Ahu boy he had known since childhood, lift his eyes from the binnacle and grin from ear to ear. At the same moment Tari felt a hand slip into his own, and heard a small, familiar voice say, "I'm here." It was Apakura, more serious than usual and a little frightened, but not to be put off longer. They were married in Tahiti a fortnight later. It was Apakura's voice that awakened me. She was leaning over the bulwark in eager conversation with her mother, who had come off in the first canoe. The air was fresh with the cool dawn. In the east the sky was flushing behind scattered banks of trade-wind clouds, tinted in wonderfully delicate shades of terracotta. A dozen big outrigger canoes of the type peculiar to this island were coming out through the passage, each paddled by 4 men, who shouted as their heavy craft dashed through the breakers. Little by little, not at all after the manner of traditional dawn in the tropics, the light increased until Ahu Ahu lay fully revealed before us. The smoking reef, the shallow lagoon, and the cliffs, their summits plumed with coconut palms. A crowd of islanders was already gathering on the reef, and I could see others making their way down the steep path from the settlement. As the sun rose, the colors of the scene grew stronger. Green palms, gray cliffs, white walls of the village, pale blue of the sky, azure of the sea water. There is no color in the world that I have seen like the blue of the water off the Ahu Ahu reef. So vivid, so intense, one felt that a tumbler of it, held up to the sun, would be a mass of sapphire, or that a handkerchief dipped in it would emerge strongly dyed. Apakura was going ashore with her mother. Standing in the narrow canoe, she directed the stowing of her luggage, a mat, a bright patchwork quilt, a box of cedar wood. Tari was awaiting the coming of the traders, for the schooner was stocked with good Tahiti rum, and the rites of welcome would take place on board. "There they are," he said, pointing to 2 white figures wading gingerly across the shallow lagoon to the reef. "You're going to meet a pair of rare ones. They've been hard doers in their time." The distant figures reached the edge of the boat passage, and I could see a boy beckoning them into a waiting canoe. But now they stopped and seemed to argue with many gestures. Terry chuckled. "No use trying to hurry them," he told me. "They're discussing the loss of the Esperanza. She went ashore here in the late '90s, a full-rigged ship. Peter was one of her crew. Charley had just come here to trade and saw the whole thing. They've spent 20 years thrashing out the question of whether or not the wreck might have been avoided. Every morning after breakfast, Charley strolls across to Peter's house to smoke a pipe and discuss some of the fine points. Every evening after tea, Peter returns the visit, and the argument goes on till bedtime. Charley's an American, an old man now, close to 70. He put in 30 years on Hiva-Oa in the Marquesas before he came to Oahu. I'd like to have some of his memories. Notice his arms if he pulls his sleeves up. He has 16 children in Hiva-Oa and 14 here, all numbered. He says he never can remember their heathen names. When his wife died in the north he gave all his land to the children and left on the first schooner. She touched at Papeete, but he didn't go ashore. Then she made Oahu, where he landed and established himself a second time. He has never seen a motor car, a telephone, or an electric light. Presently the canoe came dancing alongside, and the two old men clambered painfully over the rail. Peter, thin, hatchet-faced, stooping. Charley, the ruin of a magnificent man. He towered above any of us on the deck. This ancient dweller among cannibals, still erect, his head still carried proudly, but the flesh hanging loose and withered on his bones. It was easy to fancy the admiration he must have inspired 40 years ago among the wild people in whose eyes physical strength and perfection were the great qualities of a man. In the cabin, while the cook squeezed limes for the first of many rum punches, Charley took off his tunic of white dill, and as he sat there in his singlet, I saw that his arms and chest, like his face, were tanned to an incredible dull brown, and that patterns of tattooing ran from wrist to shoulder, greenish blue and barbaric. I never learned his history. It must have been a thing to stir the imagination. Once as we sat drinking, Tari mentioned Stevenson, and the old man's face brightened. "Ee," he said slowly in native fashion, "I remember him well. He came to Hiva-Oa with the Casco. A funny fellow he was, thin. There was nothing to him but skin and bones, and questions he'd ask you 100 in a minute. I didn't take to him at first, but he was all right. I didn't care how he dressed. One day I saw him walking on the beach with nothing on but a pair of drawers. The cook plied back and forth, removing empty glasses and bringing full ones. As each tray was set on the table, Peter, typical of a lively and garrulous old age, seized his glass and held it up. "Hurrah!" he explained. "Down she goes," drawled Charley, and Terry murmured, "Cheerio!" At the end of 2 hours Charley's eyes were beginning to glaze, and Peter was mumbling vaguely of the Esperanza. Terry rose and beckoned to me. "Make yourselves at home," he said to the old men. "I've got to go ashore. Akatora will give you lunch whenever you want it." As our canoe made for the reef, my companion told me there was to be a feast in his honor, and that his wife wished me to be present. We shot into the passage without a wetting. The people crowded about Terry, laughing, shaking his hand, speaking all at once, an unmistakable warmth of welcome. The settlement, reached by a short, steep trail, lies at the base of a break in the cliffs. At the door of her mother's house, Apakura met us, turned out, as becomes a supercargo's wife, in the choicest of trade finery. She wore heavy golden earrings, bands of gold were on her fingers, and her loose frock was of pale embroidered silk. Her mother, the keen-eyed old woman I had seen in the canoe, made me welcome. In the afternoon, when the feast was over and we rose stiffly, crammed with fish and taro and baked pig, I asked Terry if he knew a youngster who would show me the best path to the interior of the island. A boy of 10 was soon at the door, a dark-skinned child with a great shock of hair and legs disfigured by scars of old coral cuts. A twisting path, cobbled and wide enough to walk two abreast, led us to the summit.